Welcome to the historynetwork.org podcast. This episode is brought to you by lynda.com, and we have a great offer coming up later in the show from them, and also news of the following episode, which is all about a fascinating detail of Operation Foxley, so do stay tuned for those. Season 18, Episode 3, Napoleonic Cavalry. The musket might have revolutionised the battlefield, allowing relatively unskilled levees to become truly dominant, but up until the machine guns of the First World War stopped the cavalry in their tracks, the mounted horseman had a vital role to play in any conflict. The scale of the Napoleonic-era armies resulted in a huge commitment to cavalry units. Napoleon stated that, overall, the numbers of cavalry in the French army will be 1/6 the strength of infantry. At Austerlitz, the French had over 11,000 cavalrymen. At Wagram, close to 30,000. It was more than a blunt instrument. It screened the army, it reconnoitred in advance, and it would pursue and harass the enemy. Most importantly, it was highly mobile. Cavalry had developed into two arms, heavy and light, though by the time of the Napoleonic War there was a lot of grey area between these two simplistic descriptions. The heavy cavalry was a descendant of the medieval knight. Much of the armour had been shed, leaving just the cuirass, the breast and backplate, and helmet. Indeed, some units had shed their armour altogether. This saved weight and assisted manoeuvrability, whilst also reducing cost. The horses used were the largest available, and consequently the availability of these large horses would dictate the amount of heavy cavalry that an army could field. The British general and politician Sir Robert Wilson described Russian heavy cavalry. The heavy Russian horses are matchless for a Union size, strength, activity, and hardiness. Whilst formed with the bulk of the British cart horse, they have so much blood as to never be coarse, and withal are so supple as naturally adapt themselves to the manège. In many respects, their raison d'être was to carry into the enemy line with so much weight and force as to smash it, riding in very close formation, the riders knee to knee, a solid mass. The preferred formation was to do so in line, too deep. William Hay, a cavalry officer, observed a heavy charge at Waterloo. They came down the slope like a torrent, shaking the very earth and sweeping everything before them. The heavy brigade from their weight went over the infantry and through them. It struck me with astonishment, nor had I until then, notwithstanding my experience as a cavalry officer, ever considered what a great difference there was in the charge of the light and heavy dragoon regiment, from the weight and power of the horses and men. Discipline was key. To charge headlong at full pelt would cause the formation to break up. Wellington noted the necessity to keep the charge, as well as all other movements, at the pace with which at least the middle-goers, if not the slowest, can keep up. Otherwise the horses are jaded before the moment of exertion arrives, and it becomes impossible for any man to produce the great effect with the cavalry of which it is capable. This would result in a steady advance before a relatively slow charge. In the British Army, the cavalry would advance at a brisk trot until within 250 yards of the enemy, before then moving to a gallop. At 80 yards the charge order was given, and the formation increased speed as fast as was pertinent to hold formation. In many cases, the sight of the heavy cavalry bearing down on infantry would cause them to waver and break. This morale factor was important. As already talked about in our previous episode looking at Napoleonic infantry, if infantry were deployed in square formation and kept their cool, horses would not usually charge. The volleys of fire and hedgehog of bayonets would cause the horses at the last minute to pull up in terror. No amount of encouragement would spur them forward. At Waterloo, French cavalry failed to break Wellington's infantry in square. The French General Joseph Rognan stated the cavalry, having gained positions amidst the Allies, allowed themselves to be almost all killed under a dreadful shower of projectiles rather than abandon it. Heavy cavalry units were used carefully, often kept in reserve to be called upon to deliver the killer blow. Wellington was always short of heavies, and they were used sparingly by the British. It was the lighter units that did much of the workaday duties. They were called upon to watch over the safety of the army, and they were constantly hovering in advance and on the flanks, creating a screen to prevent all possibility of surprise on the part of the enemy. They were also dispatched foraging, and in the case of a victory would pursue and harass the enemy in retreat, though on occasion they would be used for shock action. These light units could be uhlans or lancers, light dragoons, chevaux légers or chasseurs, and hussars. All were mounted on lighter horses than the heavy regiments. They were quicker, the horses needed much less fodder, and were more readily available. Working often away from the main body of troops, many of the light units gained a certain reputation, which perhaps became self-fulfilling, as the French cavalry officer Albert de Rocca put it. The hussars and chasseurs were generally accused of being plunderers and prodigal, loving drink and fancying every fair thing while in the presence of the enemy, accustomed, one might almost say, to sleep with an eye open, to have an ear always awake to the sound of a trumpet, to reconnoitre far in advance during a march, to trace the ambuscade of the enemy, to observe the slightest traces of their marches, to examine defiles, and to scan the plains with eagle eyesight. They could not fail to have acquired superior intelligence and habits of independence. For ever smoking to pass away his life, the light horseman, under his large cloak, braved in every country the rigour of the season. The most extravagant of the light cavalry were the Hussars, originally Hungarian light cavalry. During the Napoleonic Wars the name was taken as other countries raised their own Hussar units, often copying their distinctive dress with the braided jackets and the fur-trimmed pelisse worn over the shoulder. The British put 4 light dragoon regiments over to being Hussars. They were the only regiments in the British Army to sport moustaches. In the French army they were known for having braided hair until it was outlawed. The Hussars of Napoleon created the tradition of sabrage, the opening of a champagne bottle with a sabre. The daring Hussar General Antoine Lasalle declared any Hussar not dead by the age of 30 was a blackguard. This typifies the attitude of hard drinking, womanizing, and brave to the point of rashness. Lasalle lived to be 34 before being killed at the Battle of Wagram. The British military historian Sir Charles Oman describes the Hussars as intended to be the lightest of light cavalry, and were to find their proper sphere in raids and reconnaissance rather than in pitched battles. The more numerous and less glamorous light cavalry regiments were not expected to charge home against formed infantry, merely harass and pursue enemies. The lighter horses with good endurance were fast and could survive where the heavy horse might struggle. A typical French chasseur or British light dragoon would be armed with a sword, carbine, and pistol. The Polish uhlan were light cavalry who carried a lance, much applauded and which others copied. Napoleon raised regiments of chevaux légers lanciers. The British converted some light dragoon regiments to lancers also. At Waterloo the French lance was approximately 3 metres or 9 feet 10 inches long. The extra reach provided by the lance offered advantages over the sabre. Attacking other cavalry It allowed the carrier to engage the enemy before they could use their sword. It also was effective against infantry in square formation, where the lance could reach into the hedgehog of infantry bayonets. At the Battle of Dresden in 1813, heavy rains had dampened the gunpowder, thus decreasing the chances for discharge. Consequently, the Austrian infantry, formed in squares, was able to withstand the initial French attempts at penetration. To overcome this, the French cavalry commander, Marshal Murat, effectively used his lancers as the breach force element to successfully pierce the enemy line. For all that, the lance did have the disadvantage of being very difficult to master, and a bad lancer not only struggled with it, but it also impaired his horsemanship. Light cavalry charged in a similar style to its heavy brethren, though often a looser formation. One might expect heavy cavalry attacking light to be a foregone conclusion, but in practice the light units' extra mobility allowed them to avoid the initial contact, or even split into two wings, passing by the heavies on each side as they charged through. Once the light cavalry was amongst the heavily armoured men on their large horses, they had the advantage of manoeuvrability. It was certainly not unknown for the light cavalry to defeat the heavy, as this description of an action at Waterloo by Edward Cotton shows. The Hussar was without a cap and bleeding from a wound in the head, but that did not hinder him from attacking his steel-clad adversary. He soon proved that the strength of cavalry consists in horsemanship, and not being clad in heavy defensive armour. The superiority of the Hussar was visible from the moment the swords crossed. After a few wheels, a tremendous facer made the Frenchman reel in his saddle, and all attempts to escape his more active foe became unavailing. A second blow stretched him on the ground amidst the cheers of the light horseman's comrades. Reconnaissance, patrolling, and screening the armies meant that the light cavalry was often in constant, low-level action as they bumped into opposing cavalry performing the same duties. This constant skirmishing allowed the cavalry to use their firearms. A grey area between light and heavy cavalry had always been the use of firearm. There had been a school of thought that, armed with a carbine or rifle, the cavalry could operate as a highly mobile infantry. In practice, a third of the unit would need to be held back to look after the horses, and units used as such were neither good infantry nor made for good cavalry. Cavalry used as a form of mounted infantry was never widely accepted and fell out of fashion. Napoleon in 1807 returned his dragoons back to full cavalry duties rather than use them as mounted infantry. Nevertheless, lighter cavalry remained issued with a carbine and pistol. The carbine, a short musket, was very inaccurate. The short barrel allowed it to be fired from horseback, and if need be, one-handed, though as one commentator wrote, "A man who is a tolerably fair shot on his own legs may find himself much puzzled upon a shy or hot-tempered horse, as a horse artilleryman would be perplexed to take a good aim with an 18-pounder in heavy seas on board a ship." The carbine was most useful when dismounted, performing picketing duties or enforcing a skirmish line. The principal weapon for most cavalrymen was the sabre. For the heavy cavalry this was a straight blade with a single cutting edge, with the non-cutting edge, the back, thicker to provide strength. These were heavy, broad-bladed swords, sometimes with a basket guard to protect the hand. There was much debate as to the best use of the straight sabre. Some advocated the thrust and some the cut. When charging with a straight sword, it would be held with the sword pointing directly ahead, the elbow almost straight, the hand relatively high, and the blade point a little lower than the hilt. Most importantly, the thumb was braced and the wrist locked. Such a blow accurately delivered at speed would almost certainly prove instantly fatal. The skill was then to remove the blade from his dead opponent. During the American Civil War, a similar cavalry sword was nicknamed the wrist breaker. With its weight, it made a good bludgeon and chopping weapon. A hacking cut would cause horrendous damage. Sergeant Charles Ewart captured a French Imperial Eagle at Waterloo. It was in the charge I took the eagle off the enemy. He and I had a hard contest for it. He made a thrust at my groin. I parried it off and cut him down through the head. After this a lancer came at me. I threw the lance off my right side and cut him through the chin upwards through the teeth. Next a foot soldier fired at me, then charged me with his bayonet, which I also had the good luck to parry, and I cut him down through the head. Thus ended the contest. The light cavalry sabre was no less lethal. With a pronounced curve, it was shorter and lighter than its heavy counterpart. The nature of light cavalry duties resulted in more individual combat. The light sabre provided more dexterity and swordsmanship. The curved blade made it a good slashing and cutting weapon. The curve of a sabre, if it is pronounced enough, allows a slicing blow to be delivered. Because of this, it is not directly reliant on the weight of the blade to give it a cutting ability. It can be relatively lighter and handier than a straight cut-and-thrust sword. Curvature also gives a sword relatively greater manoeuvrability, length for length, than the heavy sabre. The curve allows the sword to be moved tightly across the body from side to side, a great advantage for a cavalryman with a horse's head and neck in front of him. The curved sword also has an advantage that in the heat of close combat a cut is a far more instinctive blow than a thrust, so that a sword optimized for cutting will be more effective in the hands of the average trooper. The British 1796 pattern sabre had a thicker tip, though this affected the balance and the added weight made slashes far more brutal. An officer of the British 13th Light Dragoons at Campo Mayor 1811 can attest to the abilities of the light cavalry sabre. The French colonel, Chameray, 26th Dragoons, was killed by a corporal, Logan, of the 13th. This corporal had killed one of his men, and he was so enraged that he sallied out himself and attacked the corporal. The corporal was well mounted and a good swordsman, as was also the colonel. Both defended for some time. The corporal cut him twice in the face. His helmet came off at the second, when the corporal slew him by a cut which nearly cleft his skull asunder. It cut in as deep as the nose through the brain. Once a unit had put in its attack, the momentum would carry the cavalry through the enemy in moments. A well-disciplined unit would rally and reform for the next attack, though Wellington thought British cavalry more than a match for the French. I considered one squadron a match for two French. He was wary of them, galloping at everything once the enemy broke. Over-exuberant cavalry could be very susceptible to counter-attack. A successful counter-attack could be devastating for a cavalry unit. The mobility of the horse resulted in a unit dispersing very fast. Attempts to rally a routed cavalry unit could take too long as to rule them out of further action. At Waterloo, General Dornberg attacked a single French cuirassier regiment with the British 23rd Light Dragoons and the 1st Light Dragoons, King's German Legion. They outnumbered the French 2-1, hitting the French in the flanks. They were routed, and the entire British unit dashed after the retreating French. Unlike the British, the French had kept two squadrons in reserve, which were able to successfully counter-attack, smashing Dornberg's men. Another instance occurred at Waterloo. Once the aforementioned Sergeant Ewart had captured his eagle, his unit, the Scots Greys, pressed on. Their intervention had saved the 92nd Highlanders, where one of them wrote, "The Scots Greys actually walked over his column." But after wading through the French column, rather than rally and reorganise, they actually gained momentum. The unit lost its cohesion as individuals veered off from the main body to deal with small bands of fleeing French infantry. As the cavalry approached the next line, the French were able to form into squares. Unable to penetrate, the British pressed on to the main French lines. By this time their horses were exhausted. There was now no clear objective, and they were disorganised. As the French put in a countercharge, their batteries opened up on the horsemen milling about. Lieutenant Archibald Hamilton describes the confusion following the collapse of control. The General, Ponsonby, his aide-de-camp, and I got, however, about 30 of them, Union dragoons, collected together, in the hope of reassembling all who remained of those who had come on, for a great many, particularly of the officers, had remained with the prisoners, when the colonel of the dragoons came past us at full gallop, with about 20 men of his regiment following him. In a second, all the men which we had collected set off in the same direction. When they made it back to the British lines, both commanders had been killed, and of the 3 squadrons, barely 2 under-strength squadrons remained. While horses are still used, World War I brought about the realisation that it was over for the cavalry, and in the post-war years, horses were withdrawn in huge numbers as motorised vehicles, and armour replaced them. Now, in a moment, we'll be looking ahead to episode 4 of season 18, a fascinating episode written by Paul Bernardi, who is writing a script for us for the first time. But, as I said, a little more on that in a moment. Because, as I mentioned at the start of today's episode, we've got a great special offer for you from lynda.com. We're giving you the opportunity to access the entire library of lynda.com learning for free. That's right, totally free. So why not kickstart your new year and challenge yourself to learn something new with a free 10-day trial to lynda.com. In case you've never heard of lynda.com before, that's lynda.com. Lynda.com we absolutely love, and millions of people worldwide love it too. Lynda.com has over 3,000 courses on topics like web development, photography, visual design and business, as well as software training like Excel, WordPress and Photoshop. All of their courses are taught by experts, and new courses are added to the site every week. Whether you want to set new financial goals, find a work-life balance, invest in a new hobby, ask your boss for a raise, find a new job, or improve upon your current job skills in 2015, lynda.com has something for everyone. So sign up for your free 10-day trial today by visiting lynda.com/historynet, and you'll get unlimited access to every course on lynda.com, access to view tutorials on tablets and iPhone and Android mobile devices, and access to new courses added every week. Now, being just the two of us here at the History Network, we do everything from recording and editing the podcast to maintaining the website, which needs graphics and some basic coding. Neither of us are a master at any of these things. We started the podcast thinking we could do audio, but the rest we've had to learn on the job, and this is where lynda.com comes into its own. When we first got started back in 2005, Angus went through the Dreamweaver tutorials. If you find a section you know all about, you can skip it, or if there's a section you want to specifically know about, you can go straight to it. And the beauty is that if you need a refresher, then you can just watch a particular step, lesson or tutorial as many times as you like. The Ancient Warfare magazine podcast we produce is another great example of how we've used lynda.com. Some of you may or may not know we produce a video version of the Ancient Warfare magazine podcast and publish it to YouTube. The title sequence for this was created using Adobe After Effects. Not being professional special effect people, this was another skill we've had to learn on the job. Creating all those layers and how to blend them together, it's all there on lynda.com. So we're delighted to be able to offer you this amazing offer from lynda.com to you, our listeners. 10 days access to the total of their learning for free, even the new ones added during your free trial period. And all you have to do is use the link lynda.com/historynet. Now that's lynda.com/historynet. We really hope you'll go and take a look and help us out by using that link. The link again, lynda.com/historynet. So on to episode 4 in a couple of weeks. Now this is set to be a fascinating look into Operation Foxley. On the 23rd of July 1998, the Public Records Office published a number of files that had previously been held in secret in respect of activities planned and undertaken by the Special Operation Executive, or SOE, in Western Europe during the Second World War. Now, most of this published material was pretty mundane stuff, but one document mentioned an operation codenamed Operation Foxley. What made Operation Foxley so interesting was the fact that it described a hitherto unknown and unsuspected plan to assassinate Adolf Hitler at the height of the conflict. Although this operation was never put into practice, it nonetheless captures the imagination about the minds of the people who were tasked with putting the plan together. So join us in a couple of weeks for that fascinating look into Operation Foxley, written by Paul Bernardi. Now, would you like to write a script on a topic we've not covered yet? Why not drop us a line? Some of our most popular episodes have been written by listeners. You can support us in a number of other ways as well. You can make a donation using the donate button at the website. You can buy an older season from our store. These files are entire seasons, chaptered into the episodes, and cost just £2 each. You can follow us on Twitter. We are at History Network on there, and you can like our Facebook page. Just search for The History Network on Facebook to find us there. And please remember the fantastic 10-day offer on lynda.com. That's lynda.com/historynet, or there's a link direct to that offer at the website thehistorynetwork.org. So do get in touch if you've got ideas for podcasts, would like to write a script for us, or want to bring us up on an error or point of contention. Whatever it is, we love to hear from you. And it's info@thehistorynetwork.org to be able to contact us that way. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Angus Wallace, read by Nick Barker.